Yo, the name's Alpern, and I can hardly contain my excitement for the new RTS Manowar 2 releasing on the 15th of May. Now, this video is going to be a very brief overview of the gameplay loop, the single-player content, and the multiplayer content before digging into some of my own personal thoughts. Starting with the gameplay loop of Manowar 2, it does have quite a few similarities with other games such as the previous entries in the franchise, as well as games such as Gates of Hell. You control units that you field into the battle, and depending on the game mode, you're generally only going to be capped by a population cap. And units do not cost resources to call in, but they are solely capped by this popularity cap. This, however, does not mean that units are throwaway, as you can only field so many units before you run out dry. Something like a King Tiger, while being a massive field presence and extremely tough to take out, costs a massive amount of population cap to field, thus reducing the amount of support you can bring together with it, as well as costing a lot of battle rating, which is another cap that the unit costs in order to add it to your roster of units. Every unit, as such, has their own role to play, and they are all very important for your success. Everything in this game is extremely lethal, as a single half-track can move down a metric ton of infantry in just a few seconds, given that you have a good enough position and good vision of said infantry. Thus, tons of counterplay exists. You can be sneaky with infantry, ambushing vehicles or static artillery, or use artillery to displace defensive fortifications, or using planes to suppress vehicles, or use anti-air to bring down sad planes. Victory points is what decides the victor of a match, and the condition for gaining victory points depends on the game mode that you're playing. The only constant here is that destroying enemy units, and specifically high value units, gets you victory points. So if you have high value units that are heavily damaged, you most likely want to retreat them so that they can heal up, while simultaneously denying those victory points for your opponent. Most often there is also some sort of territory dynamic, where owning a majority of territory nets you victory points. Very often there is also bonus dynamic mini objectives, such as attacking a specific position within a given time frame, or killing 3 snipers, etc. These mini objectives and the way the game is set up with the population caps means that the best way to success is playing closely with teammates, supporting each other's compositions by filling in their weak spots. This can be done in a myriad of ways, as everything in this game is actually simulated. For instance, there is no generic cooldowns for throwing grenades. Instead, each unit has access to their own inventory, with X amount of grenades, Y amount of ammunition, and so on. This means that supply is very important once you reach the later stages of games, where vehicles have been fighting for a long time. They might need refueling and resupplying before bringing them back into the action. This makes matches truly tell their own story, where sometimes you have this super heroic unit that have been fighting for a long time, and maybe you get to resupply it before it continues fighting until you win, or it holds a brave last stand as the supplies are too far away, or the tracks have been destroyed so it's a sitting duck in enemy territory. Getting direct control with the press of the button really furthers this story narrative that you can make for units, as you get really close to the action and things suddenly feel a lot more personal. Now, before I continue with the thoughts of the game, here's a brief overview of what Manowar 2 contains in terms of its content, and we'll begin here with the single player portion. The single player is split into 4 sections. First, you got the story mode, which contains 3 separate narrated campaigns, one for each of the 3 factions. Soviets advancing on the Eastern Front, Americans advancing in France, and the Germans on a retreat in Germany, starting from the Siegfried Line. These 3 campaigns all contain fully narrated stories, with plenty of voiceover from protagonists, which you play as. These are generally officers or commanders of some form, and you get to follow their experiences throughout the war, as well as learn about the other characters that they interact with. Generally, these campaign missions are heavily scripted, with submissions and events happening as you play. The missions themselves are sometimes extremely difficult, and some of them took me multiple attempts, even on easier difficulties, which may speak for my ability to play the game as someone who's never played the franchise before. Especially some of the German missions were incredibly difficult compared to the Soviet ones, so I do think there may be an order that you're meant to play these in for a better difficulty curve. Overall, I think these story campaigns are quite nice, though the voiceover and narration can be a bit lacking at times. The scripted events can also be a bit clunky, as you often have to do something very specific that may or may not fully come across from the mission description. The next section, the historical section, contains 3 historical large-scale operations, one for each faction. These are set missions that follows the historical path that these operations took place in. However, each operation has its own tech tree where you decide how you specialize your forces throughout the operation. The tech tree functions very similar to how these tech trees work in games such as War Thunder or World of Tanks, where each unit has its own XP that you can acquire by using that unit. This XP then allow you to unlock new units that follows in the very same branch. You also get a global XP, which you can decide to spend on any of the branches, and finally you also have a currency that you spend to buy the unlocked units for use in the operation. These tech trees are reoccurring through the other 2 single-player sections as well, however the trees themselves are different. For instance, the historical tech trees only has access to units that saw use in that operation. Meanwhile, the very next section, Conquest Mode, has access to units that often were just prototypes and didn't actually see any use in the war. Now, the Conquest Mode, or perhaps a better name would be the Dynamic Campaign, instead of being a set of missions for a single regiment, has taken a few lessons from Gates of Hell. Here you control multiple regiments, each with their own units. You take turns deciding what areas to attack on a dynamic map and defend from the AI attacking. With a huge technology tree for each of the factions and many different regiments and combinations to try out, as well as paths to take on the dynamic campaign, this was a lot of fun. And I spent countless hours here just grinding it out versus the AI as I narrated my own stories for my regiments. Now the final mode, the raid mode, is something I haven't really seen before. I describe it as essentially a set of generated skirmish battles that gets generated each time you start a new run. This means that these are never the same, and each time they have a new set of objectives, maps and skirmish scenarios to play through, which is really cool. And as these are always completely unique, even compared to someone else playing them or you from the first time you play them to the very next time, the replayability here is extremely nice. Now, all of the 4 single-player sections also provide bonuses for multiplayer and skirmish as you unlock units to use within the multiplayer regiments. Now, all of these 4 sections in the single-player content can also be played in co-op with your friends, including even the dynamic campaign. And this is just extremely cool to me. I mean, I do really think that Manowar 2 plays the best if you have friends to play with. Now, that is a massive amount of single-player content, but I would still like to make the case that this title is mostly a multiplayer game, as the amount of multiplayer content here is honestly a bit staggering. For starters, everything you can expect from a modern multiplayer RTS is available here. You have in-depth tech trees, comparison views for different units, you have replays, reconnection features at the disconnect, matchmaking, leaderboards, all available within the client menus. There is also multiplayer challenges and objectives that helps you unlock units and regiments very generously, and pretty much every match that you play as a beginner will unlock something to use. For multiplayer, there is 3 separate matchmaking queues, combined arms, Classic and Battalions. Combined Arms and Classic can each be played 1v1, 2v2 or 3v3, and neither of these uses the regiment system. Instead, they have their own rules. In Combined Arms, you control the entire faction roster with increased pop cap, and in Classic, you buy units using resources that are given over time within the match. However, what I would consider to definitely be the main mode in Manowar 2 is battalions, which is played up to 5v5. In battalions, you control a specific regiment that you specialize before the battle. The amount of team play required here, I feel, truly goes beyond what the Company of Heroes franchise has ever had, and the battles are very often massive spectacles within these 5v5 matches, while individual players still having a pretty massive impact on the matches, as everything is so incredibly lethal in Manowar 2, making every player have absurd potential to change the outcome of a match. The multiplayer regiments are your loadout that you load into a match with. Here you pick your units by changing the number of units that you bring, as well as their types. Units have different strength required, and you try to make the best use of your available strength. Different slots have different units available to them, dependent on which slot it is, echelon, regiment, as well as the faction. The regiment system is offered for each faction with 3 set branches. You have support, infantry, and armored. The support regiments are generally forms of artillery regiments that has access to more artillery units and modifiers for whichever specific branch of support you'd like to invest into. For instance, the Soviet self-propelled artillery regiment gets modifiers for self-propelled artillery, while also having access to a lot more specialized artillery units. It also has a negative modifier for infantry, emphasizing its role on the battlefield. This is in quite stark contrast to infantry regiments, such as the 1st Infantry Battalion, that has massive bonuses for infantry while having access to stronger and more specialized infantry types. This really emphasizes the team play aspect, as players will have to get the most use out of their own regiment, while supporting each other and making massive combined efforts to capture dynamic objectives that present itself in matches. Now, these set branches, while they're called support, infantry, and armored, are themselves quite wide. For instance, in infantry you have things such as mechanized infantry regiments or airborne regiments with a lot of paratroopers that can infiltrate and disrupt enemy supply lines, or you have the armored regiments where you have some things like the medium regiments that are filled with medium vehicles, or you have some of those super heavy tank regiments that bring some of the heaviest vehicles in the game. And that essentially covers everything of my overview of Manowar 2. Now for my thoughts. This is actually my most anticipated release of 2024, and I do feel as if Fulcrum really delivers, especially when compared to other titles. I have played hundreds of hours across the playtests the past year, and as a newcomer to this franchise, I am extremely intrigued by the gameplay loop and many of the features, such as the dynamic objectives and the playfulness of some of the game modes just feels so fresh. Now, while this game is not a direct competitor to Company of Heroes, as the gameplay loop in Co is so vastly different, not to mention the quality of animations, flavor, and identities in Company of Heroes is on a completely another level compared to Manowar 2, I think this game has a massive amount of leverage, specifically when comparing it to the Company of Heroes team games. In many ways, Company of Heroes team games has always felt very flat to me, and I do not get that feeling at all from Manowar 2. In some ways, the often janky animations and the far from smooth flow Manowar 2 has in its controls, inventory, and somewhat complicated systems adds a different kind of satisfaction when you pull off cool maneuvers, and many of these systems lend themselves extremely well to the team-based multiplayer. The game is not easy to play, actually very far from it, and some of the mechanics are needlessly convoluted, making it have an incredibly steep learning curve with things such as just how camouflage works. But this also makes it incredibly satisfactory mastering these systems. The amount of available content with the 3 factions is also just so staggering. There is so many units here, and I really don't think they had to go so hard with so many unit types and their various mechanics, and in this overview I'm truly only scratching the surface. Progression in the game also feels very good, as you're constantly getting access to new units and regiments. Even with hundreds of hours, I obtain new things. If you see the progression currency, you might be a bit worried about microtransactions, and believe me, you're not alone. However, I personally find solace in that Fulcrum has repeatedly shut down the idea of adding microtransactions, and they've denied that you will ever be able to buy this currency for real money. so I'm hoping they stay true to their words here. There has also been quite extensive rumors about 2 more factions, the Japanese and the British being added later down the line, though I've yet to see any official announcements, and I think it's quite early given that the game hasn't even released, but boy am I excited for what new content they will bring later down the line. At least with the amount of content here, we'll be well occupied until then. This was my overview and thoughts on Manowar 2. Thank you for watching.